before the flood, lots of things were different. The springs came up from the ground.
There was no rain.
And watered the earth. There wasn't any rain. If you read in Genesis, springs came up and watered the ground. And there was no, before the fall, there was no death. But after the fall, there was death. But there wasn't any, animals weren't being buried in sediment. So all these animals that are buried in the sediment, that's all from a massive flood. So before that was very different.
I was thinking of it actually as the beginning core. It's right there, you know, and then everything's built on top of it.
Right, so that's the beginning, and then everything's built on top of it. And there wouldn't be all this mile of rock with all the fossils in it if there wasn't a flood. By the way, fossils don't just, form today everywhere. If I have a deer die in my backyard, it doesn't become a fossil, right? It just starts to deteriorate and decay. In order to have a fossil, you have to have something that was living a very short time before and is buried, and then has to be buried deep so that it can't decay, and so that the mineral deposits begin to replace the organic material. And so you don't have fossils forming today. By the way, interesting, all these layers, do you know how they date these layers?
Carbon-14.
No,
I
they
was gonna
can't
say the
because they don't have carbon-14 in them. So it's interesting because this is rock material that was somewhere else, like imagine the Grand Canyon getting eroded, transported somewhere else, deposited somewhere else. How long was the rock material over here before it got transported and deposited here? You can't date the rock particles by any kind of radioactive dating. How do you date these layers? It's very interesting. I've been to at least 8 or 10 natural history museums. San Francisco, Cleveland, Los Angeles, San Diego, Smithsonian, New York, and Washington. I've been to maybe 10 or a dozen of them. And I go through and I look at these exhibits, and it's very interesting. Down here at the New York State Museum, you go down there and you look at the different exhibits, and they'll say, well, this is, and they'll give you a date, how old it is. And then the next one's this is, and give you a date. I have never seen in all these museums any explanation of, here's how we know this is the date, here's how we determined it, here's how we know this is accurate. Never. I challenge you. Look at the exhibits.
I believe you.
They'll just say it and 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 say it, but never give you an explanation. This is a museum. Shouldn't they give you an explanation sometime? Educate you a little bit? But here's the dirty little secret.
They don't know.
They don't know. Here's actually, most of those scientists that I showed, they all believed in the young Earth. Even the founder of paleontology, the inventor of the classification system of animal life and stuff, plant and animal life, Linnaeus. So what they don't tell you is that the geologist is looking at a rock, and he goes over to the paleontologist and he finds there's certain fossils, and he says, well, how old is a fossil? When did this live? Well, it's 100 million years ago. It became extinct. It lived that time. So let's say, okay, the rock is 100 million years old. It's this, whatever layer it is, it's called Triassic or something. And then they just set the date on it. Now when the geologist, so the paleontologist finds some new fossil in the rock, and he goes over to the geologist and he says, okay, this is this rock. How old is this rock layer? Oh, well, it's a Triassic, so it's this old, 120 million years old. But he just found out from the other paleontologist, who is now going back and asking the geologist how old it is. So it goes in a circle, basically. Where did the dates actually come from in the first place? They're really based on, we have to have a certain amount of time, so we're going to have a certain amount of years that we have to have. They don't really tell you. And I was looking on the internet, looking, trying to find somebody that really gave a real good explanation, some way you could do it. Occasionally they have lava flows intruding into sedimentary rock, and they suppose that those lava flows are the same age as the rock, and then they try to date those. But those dating methods also are problematic. We can go into dating methods, by the way, radiometric. But almost all of these things, you will never see them explained because there's not really a good way to find. So, here's what's expected from the fossil record, by the way. We can talk about that, or we can talk about something else. What would you guys like to talk about? That clock's not right, by the way, is it? So you should have a branching tree with all these
No, that's
different kinds of fossils. It is.
Yeah.
But what the fossil record is it actually discovered within my adult lifetime, and it was discovered in China, that there's a certain kind of, there's shale, by the way, in Montana, the Burgess shale, that has all kinds of different phyla of animals. Remember, the phyla is the largest distinction of animal categories going back to. You've got the kingdoms, animal, plant, that's the gross distinction. And then you've got the phylum, you've got, for example, chordata could be one, and then you've got a subphylum, animals with vertebrates, animals without. And then you've got finer and finer distinction, right? So the major categories and differences, and the evolutionary story says that you have single-celled, then you have multicellular organisms, but you don't have backbones until later, and then you have different kinds of animals, more distinctive structures being developed. Well, what really happens is, not only in the United States and Montana, but also in China, this kind of shale has very fine sediment, so it preserves many soft parts. So it's hard to get a fossil of animals that don't have skeletons in them. So, but they're able to identify in this shale formation, which is actually the Cambrian, which is again that rock layer that is immediately above the Great Unconformity, the very first layer. They were able to get every single known animal phylum. There they are. There's every.
So the phylum is the classification of animals like mammals, invertebrates.
Right, well,
crustaceans.
if
That's
you,
what phylum
if you see,
is?
no, mammals, as you see, would be, let's see, mammals would be the class, but
Okay.
phylums would be the bigger even distinctions than that. Like, for example, would be animals with backbones, animals without backbones, animals with cartilage, animals with plants, certain different. So it would be the even larger distinctions.
Okay.
But you shouldn't have vertebrates at the same time you have invertebrates, because invertebrates would have come first and those would have come much later. But the point is, every single one was found in this shale. So what are people going to do? What are these scientists going to do with that? There's chordates. All vertebrates are in this phylum, by the way, including us. So there's a backbone, gills, fins. Not fish came from sponges, but they're there in the very first layer. So here's what they say. Here's what the people who still want to hold on to the story of evolution say. The most major animal groups appear for the first time in fossil record some 545 million years ago. Of course, they don't say how they know that time frame. It's relatively short on their time frame, known as the Cambrian explosion. That's explosion of life all of a sudden, right after the Great Unconformity. So it was a great worry to Darwin, the explanation of this sudden apparent explosion. It continues to persist. We haven't disproven it. It's still more and more evidence of it existing, even since Darwin. So there's major debates in paleontology. While some scientists believe there was indeed an explosion of diversity, the so-called punctuated equilibrium theory, elaborated by Niels Eldredge and the late Stephen Jay Gould, he's a famous one, Stephen Jay Gould. So they believe that there's an equilibrium, and then all of a sudden, massive quick evolution, and then there's an equilibrium. And then massive quick evolution, and then equilibrium. And of course, it happened so fast that all the intermediate stages disappeared. Well, you remember the three types of arguments? Which one is that?
The bottom one.
The evidence is all missing. It's missing. You can't disprove it. How's that scientific? So others believe that such rapid acceleration is not possible of evolution. They posit that there was an extended period of evolutionary progression of all the animal groups, the evidence for which is lost in the all but non-existent Precambrian fossil record. Remember that 1.6 billion years of missing time? It's all lost. Isn't it very interesting? Rather than rethink your theory, let's just say, well, the evidence is missing and it's just been disappeared and lost.
Well, remember, Perry, a lot of these scientists evolved from brainless apes, so we do have to be lenient with them.
I think when you're confronted with this kind of evidence and you still hold your position and you're not willing to even rethink it, it says something about why you're holding the position.
And also, if they've identified the fact that there's a pattern of rapid explosion of, right, these animals and everything growing, quicking, evolving, whatever you want to call it, then wouldn't that also still be happening today? Shouldn't we be starting to go through one of those rapid growth?
But, you know, that only happens once every so many millions of years, so of course we
Not during
can't.
climate
We
change.
can't observe it. Just because we don't observe it today, it's basically, there's no way to disprove it. It's, no matter what evidence comes along, it's sort of a undisprovable.
And it's interesting, because I've done some research into this probably like 8 years ago. Because evolution just never made sense to me, even before I had a relationship with God. It just seemed nonsensical, as you said. And it's funny that some of these scientists